are in, I didn't grab my clicker. Always one thing. Ezekiel chapter 40. Ezekiel chapter 40. Now, the Ezekiel 40 through 48 really has to be studied as a unit. And it's a terrible amount of scripture. It is very, very long. But that's the way I've been studying it. So tonight's kind of experimental in that I've never quite done a class quite like this one before, where I've tried to break up something like this before. And that's hard to explain, but let's just get into it. The kind of a recap of what we've been talking about, I've called these chapters that began when after the Lord was finished pouring out his judgment. The next chapters in Ezekiel I've just kind of entitled myself the chapters of hope, beginning in verses 34 through 37. Those chapters throughout talk about, in a grand scheme of things, the hope of Israel. He's turned his wrath away from them and turned his goodness back to them. Chapters 38 through 39, he talks about hope for the nations, and we've looked at those chapters. Tonight, we begin chapter 40, which begins the part in the chapters of hope, hope for all creation. Hope for all creation. Now, chapters 40 through 48 have four major interpretations, not to mention the many alterations to these four majors that I'm going to show to you tonight, or briefly show to you tonight. The first interpretation of what these chapters mean is a literal short-term the literal short-term interpretation. Every one of these has some problems, has some issues. Not little issues either. Has some pretty major issues. Some believe and will argue that it is that these chapters are literal and they apply to Israel in the short-term future. However, as we study these chapters, especially as we get towards the end of these, you will see that it is impossible to apply these literally to a short-term basis, because most of the things that we're going to see not only have they not happened, they've never happened, even up through today. You really have to do some scriptural gymnastics and symbolize everything in order to make this work, which I'm not a proponent of. The next big interpretation that we find of these chapters is, and I'm just making these names up as I go. These aren't what they're actually, I don't know what they're actually called, but I would just call it this, the symbolic church. And what I mean by that is people today take these chapters from Ezekiel and they say, well, these were written and they apply to the church age, and they were, which is our age, and they have been fulfilled somehow in the church age. Again, I can't figure out how they get there either, because I can't, even on a purely symbolic level with nothing literal, I can't figure out how to make that work. Next is the dispensational, and I did steal that word. The dispensational view is that chapters 40 through 48 will happen in that 1,000 years that Revelation refers to, and that you'll hear many people refer to as the millennium or the millennium kingdom, that these things will happen during that millennium kingdom. Of course, then that just brings up the whole great controversy of what is that millennium kingdom? Is it a literal 1,000 years? Is it not? When Some people have argued that that has already happened. Some people have argued that it is in the process of happening. Most argue that it doesn't happen until Christ returns and then he reigns on earth for 1,000 years. None of those arguments have ever satisfied me. Where does that leave me? It really kind of leaves me in limbo. It kind of leaves me nowhere because I don't know what to. I can't put all the pieces together. Is what I'm saying. I can't figure out how I make these things work with the Scripture. And the last, and this is the one that I would probably, I'll show my hand a little bit. The one that the approach that I probably lean towards most myself, called the prophetic apocalyptic. I'm sure I've read that somewhere. I'm sure I've heard someone call it that because I didn't come up with that on my own. The prophetic apocalyptic. Prophetic because it came from a prophet. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Ezekiel did say these things, write these things down. Apocalyptic meaning that I believe these things happen at the end of all things because I look at all of the history of the church and the history of Israel and they haven't happened yet. So if I'm not missing something and it's not symbolic, then to me, some of it applies to the people that are hearing it, and some of it applies to future generations, including even us. That's the part that I don't know, it's kind of the wishy-washy way to go about it, I guess. Or I can say I can see things that apply to them, I can see things that could apply to the future, but that's the only way I can do it is kind of wade through it like that. There are some parts that you're going to see that are clearly that if they're referring to this time and not heaven, we're going to see as a part of the vision that Ezekiel sees, he's going to see in this temple that's described, he's going to see a river flowing from the throne room or from the sanctuary. And the river starts at the sanctuary and flows all the way to the Dead Sea. And everything that it touches in the desert from the sanctuary to the Dead Sea becomes fertile and lush, and trees grow and grass grows, and the Dead Sea turns into a living sea filled with living creatures. And to me, everything about that says symbolism. It doesn't say nothing about that says to me literal. This is literally going to happen, something we can see. But anyway, as I'm putting these pieces together, I wanted to at least throw out there to you the way that different people approach this, so that if you decided, hey, I'm going to take a deep dive on YouTube and Google and YouTube, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a good thing either. You just got to kind of know what you're doing and take everything with a grain of salt. I'm going to take a deep dive on YouTube and type in Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48 sermons. You're going to get some version of every one of these beliefs. And I've never listened to one that I said, I'm on board with that 100%. I've listened to a little bit of all of them, and I've not been satisfied. It's hard to be satisfied with these things. And I sympathize with the preachers. I mean, a big part of me with the preachers, when I listen to preachers talk about these things, they just want to understand, and it's their job to understand, and it's their job to explain. And I understand the temptation, believe me, I do, to understand the Scripture and explain it. But I also can, in good conscience, say, hey, this is what I believe. I can't just pick one and say, hey, we're just going to go with this one just because, or this is the one I like the best. A lot of times people will jump onto whichever the tradition of their church believes. That's usually what you'll find. And it just happens in the Church of Christ. The Church of Christ doesn't have a strong background on any one of these, which I appreciate. I like that, just because I don't feel a pressure I don't feel like anyone's going to leave and say, so-and-so said 50 years ago that this was the right way, and Wes says that he doesn't believe it. And so I'm just glad I don't have to face any of that. I don't think I do anyway. So, all right. What we see crystal clear is probably the only crystal clear verses I'll be able to teach in these 8 chapters are the first 4 verses of chapter 40, which I've just called Ezekiel's commission. It's our only point for tonight. Ezekiel 40, verses 1 through 4. Ezekiel said, in the 25th year of our exile. So consider that. He's been in exile now for 25 years. His memories of the old way that they used to live in the temple, I mean, he can still remember it, but it's not like fresh memories now. His even memories of the last time he saw the temple, the last time he saw Jerusalem, those are distant, faded memories now. And since then, Jerusalem has been razed to the ground. It's been virtually destroyed. The temple's been destroyed. All of the gold and all the things that Solomon had in there, all the neat things from the years of David that he collected from Philistines and stuff and stuck in the temple, in the treasure houses, those are all gone. It's been looted at this point. All the gold that covered everything has been stripped off, melted off, hammered off, and taken away. So in the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the city was taken. So this is 14 years after. So it's been 14 years since Jerusalem has been destroyed and the temple has been sacked. On the same day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me there. In the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain. This is very akin to the experience I think that Paul explains. When Paul says, the Lord took me to the third heaven, which is heaven. And he said, I can't repeat what I saw, but he says, I don't know if I was in body or out of body or what. I don't really understand what state I was in when the Lord took me there, but he took me there. And that's kind of Isaiah. He's saying, the Lord took me and he set me on he didn't literally take his body, as far as he understands, and set him on a mountain. This is most likely Mount Zion. The city that he's looking at, I haven't seen anyone who doesn't believe that it's Jerusalem. However, the city's never called Jerusalem, but there's a very important reason for that, but that doesn't come until our very last lesson. So just remember I said it tonight. And on it to the south there was a structure like a city. So he sees the city from this very high mountain. So he brought me there. And behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze, with a line of flax. What's a line of flax? Well, a line of flax, that's a spool of thread, basically. And not a spool of thread so much as, imagine more of a construction line. What do you call that? What do you call that, Ed? Like a chalk line. Yeah. I mean, it's just like it's just basically a line of twine, but the kind that contractors use. Lost my place. Okay, a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand. And he was standing in the gateway. The man said to me, Son of man, see with your eyes, hear with your ears, and give attention to all that I'm going to show you. For you have been brought here in order to show it to you. Declare to the house of Israel all that you see. Okay, so he has very clear instructions. You've been brought here for me to show this to you and explain it to you. Pay attention, and I want you to repeat to Israel everything that you see. So that's very clear. Now, as he does this, I am going to show a little video of what he sees, and I'm going to